Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We have Dr. Judd Burton back with us, and we're going to shift gears a little bit. Last time you were here, we talked about vampires and folklore and cultural anthropology and the overlap between that and the Judeo-Christian world on that subject. But we want to talk a little bit about werewolves. Again, this is another subject I know next to nothing about. So this is why we have you here, Judd. And just like we did last time, for those in our audience who may not know who you are, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Certainly. My name is Dr. Judd Burton. I'm a historian by trade, primarily an ancient historian. I do work with the Greco-Roman world and early Christianity. Also have a master's degree in anthropology, which gave me my archaeological and cultural anthropological toolkit to work with. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in the anthropology of religion as a graduate student. Still am, obviously. But I wear the proverbial shoes of three different trades, historian, right, anthropologist, archaeologist.
Now, since we talked about vampires earlier, the whole thing about anthropology of religion makes a little more sense to me now, because a lot of the elements with vampirism really tread over onto religious territory. Mm-hmm. We want to talk about werewolves. Is it kind of the same thing there? I mean, we want to get a little sense of sort of the history of this idea. So how would you, again, try to explain to someone, like, where does all this stuff come from when it comes to werewolves and silver bullets and, transformation of a human into an animal and vice versa? I mean, where do we start with this?
It is very similar. It stems from the same cultural milieu that you find, in societies all over the world. Just as with the vampire, you typically have some sort of variation of a werewolf in the cultures on the globe, and not just the wolf, but there are all manner of were creatures. There are were hyenas in Africa, and were jaguars in the New World, and so on and on and on. You
so
see
it varies by region.
Varies by region
like
and culture.
The vampires.
Very much with the same with vampires.
Wow. So where do we get, again, some of the ideas that we would sort of pick up from movies and stuff like that? I mean, I know there was a distinction when we talked about vampires between your cultural anthropological explanations or origins and literary creations. Mm-hmm. Do we have that going on here as well?
Again, it's an analogous sort of situation. There, a lot of the shape-shifting element that's in werewolf or were creature, let's just say creature folklore, stems from older pre-literate, pre-industrial societies. Again, the totem or totemism, the worship mm-hmm. of the totem, the animal spirit, is very much at the center of it. And the appropriation or the taking on of these animal attributes was a central part of the cultures that embraced this idea.
Was this a blessing or a curse?
Well, it could be either. It varied from culture to culture. Okay. Just in the North American continent, for instance, if you look at the various tribes of American Indians, mm-hmm. the vision quest is a central part of, let's say, the Plains Indians, from the Sioux in the north all the way down to the Comanche in the south. And this involved an experience with an animal spirit, a totem spirit. So that's an example of an individual totem, but there were tribal and clan totems as well. The flip side of that is that whereas that was supposed to be a positive and guiding experience, the mm-hmm. flip side of that was that there could also be negative interactions, in other words. And here we go back to witchcraft being the glue that holds together a lot of these ideas. And
like a solicitation?
Well, specific, it can be, yeah,
Okay.
a solicitation. Again, defining witchcraft anthropologically, we're talking about an individual who is operating anathema to the norm, the cultural norm of whatever society they're in. They're bending nature to their will rather than working with the organic, natural course of society. And so, very often, shapeshifters in American Indian lore, and especially in the desert Southwest, very often they're a witch of some sort. And so there is certainly an evil or negative aspect to some of these elements of culture.
So, okay, how do you get from encounter, because you use the word encounter once or twice, to a person who was thought to shift? Okay, is this like a power given or a curse, bestowed, that this transformational idea?
Well, again, there's some, it could go either way.
But it's something that whatever the person encounters does for or to the person.
Right.
Okay.
And in the case of shape-shifting amongst witches in the Southwest, for instance, the listeners may be familiar with skinwalkers, a form of these shapeshifters, and they can shapeshift into any number of things: wolves, coyotes, bears, owls. Usually a creature of ill omen. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but often you find that, especially the coyote in the Southwest, who was the trickster in a lot of these stories. There's another one called the Manitou, which a person became through a kind of witchcraft. And again, it's all sort of related. But the Manitou, it's interesting. Manitou is an interesting specimen because it leaves its legacy in place names where a lot of the Algonquin-speaking tribes lived. And so Manitoba, Canada, is named after the Manitou. Manitou Springs in Colorado is named after the Manitou. There was a sergeant on the Lewis and Clark expedition who recorded at least the cultural occurrences. He recorded the idea of the Manitou in some of his logs. And so there is this sense of, yes, there's a person, let's say a practitioner, a witch within this community who can take on those shapes. Or this can be a curse that can be levied against somebody so that they take on those shapes. That's certainly something that you see in European folklore. Again, werewolfism is integrally tied with witchcraft and spell casting.
What's the relationship of this to like shaman practice, shamanism?
Again, this is the totemic element, tying back into it. And so the whatever appellation you give that professional, whether it's a shaman or...
Right, so that it's just a title.
Right,
the title.
Right. Yeah, that's going to be part of the toolkit. But again, just viewing this through the lens of strictly scholarly anthropology, those experiences are going to be viewed as something they're supposed to be beneficial for the tribe. It's when you get an individual like the witch, the anthropological definition of a witch, where the curses are levied against somebody, or they actually take on the attributions of a wolf or whatever animal.
So that person would be sort of sowing chaos or judgment or just personal vindictiveness.
All of those, yeah. It could be any of those.
Now, I can't remember what the term that's used in the Hobbit, cycle, but you have you have this in that story as well. Tolkien, have this shape-shifting character. I can't remember what his name was at this time, but in the story, it turns out to be something positive. So
I think it was Bjorn.
Yeah. So what do you think Tolkien is drawing on for that? I mean, he's obviously somebody who's well versed in comparative mythology, but he draws most of his stuff from early, Anglo-Saxon, early European.
It's Germanic, a
Okay.
lot of Germanic material, and you're going to find, of course, that's rife with all kinds of werewolf stories and shape-shifting. So Tolkien's drawing from that tradition. He's taking liberties with those sorts of ideas, I think, in a manner not dissimilar to the one that C.S. Lewis adopts in the Chronicles of Narnia. He takes a satyr
Mm-hmm.
and makes him this fellow,
Sure.
Mr. Tumnus.
Yeah.
So it may be something similar there, but of course Tolkien was also familiar with the evil and wicked manifestations, because there were vampires in Middle Earth as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you look through the Tolkien bestiary, you'll find them listed there. But there were all manner of wicked creatures that he drew off of Germanic mythology, European mythology in general.
Now, when we talked about vampirism, that had a fairly, maybe not abundant, that's not a word you would use, but a fairly clear trajectory from ancient Near Eastern material
Mm-hmm.
about the drawing out of, the life force
Mm-hmm.
in various forms. What would you point to as far as something pre-Greco-Roman here? Just we'll make it really broad. Is there anything in greater antiquity, maybe even prehistory, that winds up being part of this body of folklore?
Well, certainly you can go back to prehistory, because the shamanic element,
Okay.
is the totemic element, is certainly present there. And of course those ideas in some way get sort of transmitted through the mythological machine,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, to later generations, and you see them showing up in the early city-states of antiquity.
You know what? I think we should say too. This whole idea of animal spirits.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds really dumb to a modern person, but I mean, we sort of think the same ways, even though we don't end at the same places.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very obvious. You can look at an animal. I mean, sloth, jaguar. I mean, you're going to sort of associate certain characteristics, certain abilities, certain spirits,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or a spirit to that animal, and that's really, part and parcel of what people in the ancient world are thinking. They can make these observations too, but they're going to assign those differences maybe to different things than a modern scientist would, and they're
Mm-hmm.
going to those are going to lead to different places.
Mm-hmm.
So really, that's kind of what we're talking about: characteristics, and then if you have this thing, this animal with this characteristic, the belief was that you could somehow become in possession of it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
That's really kind of what we're getting to, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the whole idea. Again, back to the ancient, material. Do we have any sort of cross-fertilization with any ancient, ritual, any ancient, witchcraft? I'm looking for, again, specific, kinds of connections, or again, is it all just sort of these broad strokes, kind of like, what we saw earlier?
There aren't any specific incantations that come to mind. Of course, the older stuff before antiquity would have been oral tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It would not surprise me to find that there were
Mm-hmm.
incantations, but in the general sense, this shape-shifting, again, being part of a tradition of anthropological witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
The reference in Daniel is one. If we're going just pre-Greco-Roman, the reference in Daniel is interesting because, again, most of your listeners are probably familiar with that reference in Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar is sort of called out for his hubris and
Mm-hmm.
Has changed, or it seems that he's changed.
You're going to go insane for a little while, but
Right.
There is an animalistic description.
Right.
Yeah.
And so is he suffering from the psychosis of lycanthropy?
Yeah.
Or is he actually taking on the attributes as his nails grow long, he gets hairy, he's on all fours, and
that's actually a good place to ask this. Okay, what does this have to do with lycanthropy, and is there more than one variety of that?
well, it may have a number of things to do with lycanthropy. Lycanthropy being the clinical diagnosis of a kind of mental disorder.
Okay.
Um,
Where a person thinks what?
can exhibit all kinds of violent behaviors, sometimes even in conjunction with full moon.
Is it conscious, or is it something?
I think
that
it's
the,
I
that
think
the
it's
one
root.
who's doing the diagnosis.
I think its root is largely unconscious, but
Okay.
it bleeds out into conscious behavior. The Berserkers come to mind from Germanic tradition.
Okay.
Now, the Berserkers were a cadre of warriors in Norse tradition who would don bear pelts or wolf pelts, almost along the same stipulations that you find in totemism or these shamanic traditions. And they would ingest hallucinogenic mushrooms. They would drive them into a frenzy.
Yes, it sounds like a prescription for chaos.
It sounds like a prescription
I guess
for
that's
chaos.
the point.
Well, it gets even better when you consider that they ate the mushrooms and then urinated and drank the urine and then went into the frenzy. But I reference the Berserkers again because it goes back to that totemic tradition. This may be a kind of self-induced chaos that they're, self-induced psychosis that they're taking part of, but they're part of the larger chain of events and cultural elements in the story of the werewolf. In fact, the emphasis, the name itself, Berserker, means bare skin. So the emphasis is on taking on the attributes of a bear, or it could be a wolf pelt. We do have evidence of them wearing wolf pelts as well.
Well, that's really interesting, and that actually gives me a good trajectory to pursue the discussion when you come back. We need to wrap up this particular episode, but thanks for being with us again to talk about a pretty arcane subject again that I just know nothing about, but it's very interesting.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks for watching Fringe Pop 321. Once again, please don't forget to visit our website, fringepop321.com, and if you want to support what we're doing here, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S, and come back and watch more episodes, because what you know may not be so.